I'm John Ridley, and I've been a Muslim for about 30 years. I was born and raised in a very small Somerset town in the rural part of England, and my parents and my sister still live there. We were a fairly relaxed Christian family. We went to church from time to time, maybe every 3 or 4 weeks, but there was no compulsion. I went because I did believe in a God. But as I grew older and started to question, I wanted to understand more about Christianity, there were gaps in my understanding, and I could never fill those gaps. I would ask questions of my family and of the ministers at the church, and they were things that just had to be accepted. There was no question. You couldn't discuss them. And I could never understand and accept that if you had a faith but couldn't question and understand the faith, to me, the faith was missing. There was something wrong with that. And I'm still hoping that maybe one day somebody would explain to me what those missing parts of Christianity are. In particular, the Trinity. I could never understand how God could have these 3 parts, one of which was human. And also there were some, what I felt were quite dreadful teachings, such as original sin. How can a newly born child, inherit his parents' sin? It just made no sense, and nobody was able to explain those to me. By the age of 20, I knew that I believed in God, and I had my doubts, but I'd never really left England and knew nothing of the world outside, and so I didn't even know of any of the other religions apart from the briefest of study in school. So I went ahead and was confirmed into the church. A couple of years later, I was working for the BBC as a broadcast engineer, and I had the opportunity to take a 6-month secondment to the Middle East. And this was to be my first real adventure of my life. So within 24 hours, I'd left Broadcasting House in rural Dorset where I worked, and was transported to a small desert island off the coast of Oman. On the island, there was a small British community of BBC personnel and also some RAF personnel. And they built a very small makeshift church. And there were probably 10 or 15 of us would go every Sunday. And so I joined into the services, but after 4 weeks, I attended the service as usual on the Sunday, and we came to reciting the Nicene Creed. And I will never know why, but I couldn't say it. I just froze, I was in a cold sweat, and I just knew that what everybody was saying was blasphemous. So after 4 weeks on the island, I stopped going to church. And that left a large hole in my faith. I suddenly felt that the church that I'd chosen to embrace wasn't actually what I wanted. It didn't answer the questions. The doubts came back. And so I started talking during my long hours of shift work with the BBC. I'd start talking with the Pakistani staff and the Omani staff, who were Muslims, not specifically about religion, but I wanted to know about their culture and their life. And slowly the subject of religion came into our conversations. And inevitably it came up, the questions came up as to why did I have difficulty with Christianity, and the subjects of the Trinity and original sin and the other doubts were raised in conversation. And I was shocked because the answers from every single person that I spoke to were always the same. Islam doesn't believe in these things. There is no such thing as the Trinity. God is not his son. God is God. Jesus was a prophet, a human prophet. There's no such belief in original sin. Everybody is born pure, and it's up to them how they choose to lead their life. So the questions I had about Christianity were suddenly answered by Muslims in a completely different country. And this left me very, very confused. I didn't know where to turn, because everything that I'd been brought up with, the doubts that I'd lived with, were thrown straight back at me, and I was suddenly searching for answers again. So for 3.5 years whilst I was in Oman, I studied and studied. I talked with people. And then eventually, after a couple of years, I had a strange request from the Wali of Masira. He was the mayor or the leader of the island where I was working and living. And he told me that I was going to be going to Muscat to meet the Minister of Islam, one of the most senior ministers in the government. A couple of weeks later, I was on the plane and introduced to the Minister of Islam. He and I were probably talking for the best part of an hour, and we recapped the past couple of years about all the questions I'd had, the answers, and he was challenging the conclusions I'd come to. He was testing me. As the conversation went on, he realized that I'd been there for 3.5 years and was soon to go home. And so the inevitable question came up, well, what are you going to do when you go home? How are you going to feel about this? Where does this leave you on this journey? And I have to admit that I was somewhat bemused because I didn't really know where the next stage of the journey was. But I made the decision at that point that it was time to recite the Shahada, which I did. And when I came back from Oman, I spent a few weeks with my parents because I'd been away for so long. And there clearly were changes. The Middle East had influenced me in many ways, but there was a realization on the part of my family that something had changed, which they didn't like and couldn't accept. In many respects, the not eating pork was an indication of how things had changed. But no matter how you tried to approach the subject of embracing Islam, it was never accepted. And a conversation with the family could never take place. It wasn't acceptable that somebody had moved from traditional Christian beliefs into Islamic beliefs. And so really an in-depth conversation on why I made that change, never took place. And even to this day, 30 years later, we've never had that discussion, and I don't believe it will ever take place, which I think is sad, because I'm not asking them to embrace what I've chosen. That's never going to happen. Work was becoming more and more difficult to find in England, as I had to start looking elsewhere for an income. And a job came up in Saudi Arabia, which, after a lot of soul searching, I decided to take. When I got to Riyadh, I started to meet more and more Muslims, and socializing with them rekindled my interest in Islam, which had become very much dormant. And so I would start to gain question, and that led to a lot of further study of Islam. I started to go to the mosque, where at work and in my home, where I would spend a lot of time sitting and thinking and praying. This was the turning point. Until that point, even though I'd embraced Islam, I really hadn't practiced. It became a turning point in my life. And now I was lucky enough to be able to visit Mecca 3 times. Visiting Mecca changed my life, but it wasn't a spiritual change. I wanted to share the experience with my friends and family. And the only way I could do that was to write the story of the journey that I'd taken.